So today's speaker is Terri Seddon. Terri's Professor Emeritus at the Trobe University in Melbourne. She's got over 35 years of experience as a researcher and teacher in Australian universities, but her academic work, as you will know, has taken her all over the world. Her projects on travelling policies, adult tertiary education, they speak to debates about contemporary effects of globalising education and comparative sociology and transnational history. So without any further ado, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Terri. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pete. And thank you all very much for coming. It's a bit overwhelming to think that I'm speaking across to Europe at the moment, but it's also very lovely to see faces that I know and names. So it does make the feeling of community a little bit stronger, which I think is really, really important. So what I've done is a fairly detailed PowerPoint, which I'll put up and share, mainly because it'll be an opportunity for me to kind of talk past it to some extent, and hopefully you still to keep a sense of where I'm going with this. So I've called this this present. Oops, sorry. I'll have to work out how to use this system. I seem to have menus all over the slides at the moment. So. Okay, so I've called this symposium or seminar Knowledge Building Through Crisis, which is a bit dramatic. This particular slide shows a picture of a workshop that we ran as part of the project that I want to talk about, which is a project on teacher education reform in Australia. But of course, Australian teacher education reform is paralleled in many other parts of the world. And in a sense, many of us are struggling with the same kinds of issues. But this particular workshop was wonderful. It was last July. It was winter, but we had bright sunshine that day, although it was quite cold, but probably not by your standards. And I use it partly because I want to, in a way, talk through this project. I want to try to ground us in the now of this project, of our discussions there, and use that as a point of departure to then think about these more general questions of knowledge, knowledge building, and what it means to research through periods of crisis. And when I talk about crisis, I'm partly talking about 2020, but of course, crisis is itself a complex concept. And for Australia, for instance, the crisis of 2020 was not just the pandemic, it was also really fairly horrific bushfires, where, huge areas of the eastern states were burnt, and parts of the west, and where people were hearing koalas scream. Things like this, these sorts of stories were part of 2020 for us, as well as the COVID stuff. And so in a way that kind of raises this question, what does this dislocated or disturbed setting do to our work as researchers and do to our work as knowledge builders? So what I want to do is talk about this project and, in a sense, use the project as a case study of knowledge building through crisis, and then come back hopefully at the end to give some sense of where I think we've got to. This is a work in progress. We're still feeling our way very much with this. And I talk a bit more about where we're up to on the way through. So I basically have got 4 sections. I want to set up this now of the project. I want to then go to some commentary on how we understand, how we in the project, but how I understand crisis. I then want to give a little bit of an example, it's very brief, about what it means to read and write historically, which I think for me has been the solution to some extent to this problem. And then I want to make a couple of comments about teacher education beyond 2020, as in the post-pandemic teacher education. So let's see how we go. This project actually has had a checkered history. It was designed in 2016, got funded in 2017 for various messy reasons to do with universities and their intention to hold on to as much money as possible. Didn't really get going until 2018. And so our research has been conducted between 2018 and 2020. We are trying to finish now. The summary that you can see in front of you is based on the formal abstract that we put into the Australian Research Council to capture what we were trying to do. And in a sense, it's a fairly traditional kind of, let's look at a policy reform, let's do a critique on the policy itself, let's see how it was implemented, and then see actually what's happened. And so basically our data collection has been largely focused partly on a policy history and policy sociology of the TMAG reforms. They're called TMAG, Teacher Education Ministerial Advisory Group. That was a group established by the what is effectively a Conservative government, Commonwealth government in Australia in 2014 under Tony Abbott. I don't know if his name has reached some of you in Europe, but he has a particular kind of style. There was a lot of suspicion within the education community around these reforms. The recommendation was that integrated partnerships were a solution to quality teaching, and that if we had stronger accountability, then the system would get good classroom-ready teachers. There was a lot of money spent on this, and what we've done is really not focused all that much on policy critique, a little bit. We've mainly been interested in what's going on as a result of these reforms, and indeed what an integrated partnership is, how they operate, and obviously as time's gone by, how they have surfed through the intervening years and indeed 2020 itself. We're now at the point where we're trying to write chapters for a collected book, an edited collection of chapters, and that will address set of questions around globalising policies, a set of questions about partnership work and the practices of partnership within Victoria. All of our case studies are in Victoria, in a sense centred on Melbourne, although there are some that drift out towards the edges of Melbourne. We also look at some of the issues around quality teaching and in a sense that question of what it means to make the future now. What does it mean to make the future in a post-pandemic world now? And that was why we had to tackle this question of what is this crisis doing to us as researchers, rather than just assuming that we can tell that story as if we were, existing somehow out of this place, particularly because Melbourne, unlike most of the rest of Australia, has been where most of the COVID cases have been. We haven't had a lot of deaths, but it's been where most of the deaths have been. It's been a place where much of last year was spent in lockdown. And in fact, the workshop that you saw the photograph of occurred after the first lockdown and on the eve of the second lockdown, which went from the day after the workshop in July through to November. And in that time, borders were closed, quarantine requirements were in place, people were restricted to 1 hour out of the house a day within a 5-kilometre radius, and an 8 p.m. curfew existed across Melbourne. There was also what was called the Ring of Steel, which was the attempt by the government to put a boundary around Melbourne and restrict the passage of any infected people into the regions of Victoria. This caused a lot of trouble, as you can imagine. When we went to the workshop, it was in a beautiful place. It was in what are called mountains. They're not really mountains, but they're big hills, east of Melbourne, forested, beautiful mountain ash. And in winter, they're full of mists and winds and chills, but also very often sunshine. And so I've tried to use photographs to some extent to capture some of these experiences of Melbourne, because Melbourne was the place we were in. And being in Melbourne was being different to being in Sydney or in Brisbane or Perth, because they had different COVID experiences and different bushfire experiences. Our interpretation of our experience was that crisis is whole of life. And that actually as whole people, we were affected by what was going on. And I actually used this quote at the, which is from a literary journal called Overland, a Melbourne-based literary journal, as a way of opening up our discussions at the workshop in July. It was written by these two people, a woman and a man who had just become editors in December 2019, and they're reflecting on their experience as editors in Melbourne coming up to July. And I think this is a very evocative quote. "It's getting dark." We wrote that in our first editorial in December at what would turn out to be only the cusp of an apocalyptic fire season and then COVID isolation, quarantine. The tumultuous end of the neoliberal dispensation. Society turns out to exist, says Boris. It has emerged from a coma in an abandoned Soviet bunker and slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Of course, after July, we had the joys of the US election to watch. And we saw what slouching towards Bethlehem meant. It's not a pretty picture. This prompt, this quote, we used, in fact, in free writing exercises. And I'll give you some examples of what came up. One young academic wrote about her sense of anxiety that had generated at a personal level through the period of lockdown that we'd already had in July, which was only the first, 5 or 6 weeks, not the 5 months. She's a young woman with children, bringing them up in Altona, not far from where I live in West Melbourne. And I think what's really interesting in this comment is this sense that on the one hand, these threats are indeterminate, that they create risk for us as people and families, but also as professionals. And that sense of risk generates a set of concerns about the future, which affect what you can do and how you can act. And I think where she finishes, where she says, this kind of vision that we could go back to a time that I didn't even know, where there was no university for teachers. There was little recognition of the complexities of education in the discussion. But we still care about the project of education in the face of this anxiety. Another woman, also not quite as young as Claire, but relatively young, offered a performance piece in her free writing. And she basically spoke as the Minister for Education. She'd noticed that the government was taking note or listening to the health professionals, and indeed were designing government policies and various actions around the health advice. And she said, what if it was education that the government was listening to? What's interesting about this particular piece of free writing is the way the crisis for Michelle has triggered this appeal to science and to control. as a means of control. And I think that both Claire and Michelle offer a really interesting illustration of the way in times of crisis, there's a kind of split in the community amongst those who maybe fixate on matters of concern, and those who are focused much more on control and the use of facts, matters of fact, in order to control the situation, which is indeed uncontrollable, as we can see in some parts of the world. My own piece of free writing, still puzzling over these issues of crisis, occurred on the morning after the US election, when in Australia we were able to watch the early return of votes, which seemed to be going towards Donald Trump. My experience of crisis generated questions about action. And I had this sense, I actually woke up in bed and I had this feeling of hollowness, the feeling that I was inside this kind of crazy mad world. And I realized that I was no longer watching that world. I was no longer the looker. I was no longer the observer. I was in that world. That world was me. And I was part of the world silent scream. And I use that because in a sense, I think the experience of crisis troubles this relation between the looker and the liver, the person who is situated and the person who observes from a distance. And the question that I ask, therefore, in this presentation, I mustn't go on too long, is how do we interpret experience, use data, analyse truth claims and write chapters? And that's what I'd like to open up here. Because when all of this is dislocated by our setting and our situatedness, then it becomes very difficult to know how to act on any of these in a way. So let me shift focus now to a slightly more conceptual kind of plane and talk a little bit about my way of understanding crisis. I've got 4 quotes here. 2 are left justified and 2 are right justified. I'll comment on that in a minute. The first 2 quotes were drawn from chapters that have been drafted for this book. What I think is interesting is that the first one, which is from the field of teacher education, kind of suggests that crisis is just, pretty normal, largely representational, and really about government's moral panics. By contrast, a sociologist come philosopher reads crisis through a rent, and she reads them not as disasters yet, but disasters in the making. They offer us a warning, and we need to heed them. How we heed them is the question. We can't heed them through business as usual. We have to take stock. We have to turn our course to deal with the situation. The second 2 quotes are drawn from texts actually that I wrote a long time ago, back in the early 2000s. One drawn from C. Wright Mills that turns attention to the experience of people in crisis and this sense of suddenly seeing things that looked familiar as if they're strange, the sense that old decisions now seemed wrong, the sense that suddenly there's an excitement of the mind because we can be surprised, we can be astonished, and that we need to deal with that new thinking that opens up before us. And the 4th quote is from another German friend, Frigga Haug, who talks about crisis, drawing on Marx. Crisis is a rupture of established forms of living. But like she said, whether change follows depends on what people do. The trouble is that the old ways are protections, and the new ways are unknown and uncertain. And that can often make liberation a catastrophe. In a time when we face a climate emergency as well as a global pandemic, I think the question is whether we have the possibility of ignoring the disaster, of ignoring the crisis and the changing conditions. I'm not sure that we do. I note in passing that the left justified quotes are all Anglophone and male. The right justified quotes are all German and women. I note this as an observation. I think there are interesting questions about the relation between Anglophone and Eurozone knowledge building practices. But I think that would be another seminar. What I realized when I was working through this stuff is that, in fact, most of my research has been premised on an exploration of crisis. It started in 1975 when I travelled from England to Australia and found that, in fact, as a science teacher with a maths and science education, it was very difficult to make sense of this place that I'd arrived in. That, in a sense, triggered my academic career. I used crisis methodologically in my thesis in a study of the 1930s depression and also in a studies of the 1990s with restructuring, neoliberalism and globalization. And in a sense, my mobility in and between the Anglophone and Eurozone worlds and research has also been a kind of crisis of its own. You know, I have written about the experience of being on long haul 747 flights and the strange in-between place of knowledge work that is, or it was when we could fly. And certainly that experience fueled my interest in professional knowledge building, adult work and learning. So if I move then into the project, the way that we're approaching these integrated projects builds on two lines of inquiry. My own work, which has come through partly through things like the World Yearbook of Education and its studies of globalization and Europeanization, but also through my colleagues' work, which is drawn more from teacher education research and theories of practice architectures. This slide gives you a little bit of a feeling of some of the key steps in that process. The yearbook provided a really important place for learning and thinking about networked ontologies and the way travelling policies and local places kind of intersect. The 2018 World Yearbook explicitly focused on the historicising character of space-times. And we found that to be a very useful way of thinking about knowledge building in different ways that take account of not just social relations and relationalities, but also space-times and their spatialities and temporalities, the horizons that we live with, and the kind of temporal play of memory, imagination, as well as facts and experience. So that was one sort of part of this story. And through that work, I became very interested and in fact did a chapter for Marcella Milana on looking at adult education as a kind of an entangled historical sociology. And that was enormously interesting work based on Australian empirical research, but trying to bring this other theoretical framework together. The other dimension of this in terms of my work has come really since around 2019, and it's where I've become much more interested in these questions of seeing, using the work of John Berger in particular, of knowing, and how the work of knowing is a kind, it sort of recognises the agency of the looker and how they are embedded in a place and its times where a particular sort of gaze is operating. And I think his idea of a professional's right to look is a really interesting idea, that we build collectivity through our shared gaze, the look into somebody's eyes that actually builds friendships, solidarities, which invents the other and then claims autonomy. And finally, I've also done more on acting, particularly the action of professionals in workplaces where they're engaged in work and learning, using situated learning as a kind of point of departure, but then thinking in much more detail about the nature of the lived world and what it means for cultural material formations to kind of emerge and develop through space, time, and relational encounters. In this project, with what I'm trying to do, and my teacher education colleagues are kind of doing their, not doing their own thing, but we're in a dialogue around this stuff. But what I'm trying to do is to explore this question of historicised place-based partnerships and what kinds of professionals and events permit me to write a history of the TMAG reforms. Not a history in an old kind of tedious sense, if you like, but really a rereading of the TMAG reforms that take account of both what actually happened, and we are redocumenting the consequences of the TMAG reforms through our data collection, but also through the experiences of 2020 and how that's disrupted, well, you know, our collective experience and knowledge building work in the project. Let me focus in a bit more on this question of reading and writing historically. And I'm moving now from the level of, if you like, the collective work down to the chapter that I've been working on with one particular colleague who's in teacher education as a sort of dialogical process. I found the work of Gabrielle Spiegel particularly helpful in this project. And she has a really nice way of talking about this process of writing history. And I've put the quote here: historical writing is performed through and by means of a constant paradoxical movement between absence and presence. And it's the in-betweenness of that paradoxical movement that generates the narrative, the historical narrative. What I like about Spiegel is that she suggests historians have to create a corpse by objectifying a particular feature of the lived-in world and its live communities, which are continuously unfolding. Once that death has been established, it's possible to explore that corpse from the point of view of the present, from the live present. It's a bit like a doctor putting a corpse on an operating table and opening it up, interrogating that corpse with a scalpel. The historian uses, instead of a scalpel, they use questions, they use sources, and they use fragments and selections of evidence. The effect of this process is to then reread the past from the live present. But in the process of doing that, it also informs and reveals a whole set of questions and silences about this live present. And just to illustrate this, I'm sure you all know, Australia has a very strange colonial history. One of the few places, one of the only places, I think, where Britain actually didn't create some form of treaty with the first people. And so there is a question now in Australia, you know, which Australia are we talking about? And indeed, what does it mean to put those together, if that's possible? And what would it entail? For the historian, there's a really big question about which present do you write from? Which map is the map you use? Just like for the educator, which map do you educate from? Which map do you educate towards? And what does that mean? These are all important questions, I think, for teacher education. Let me plunge down into the actual process of this, this chapter. And in a sense, I've mapped its methodology a little bit. When my colleague and I started working on this, we decided to, we were trying to kind of portray the character of the partnership. And it took a while to work out that we needed to treat the TMAG reforms and the events that occurred up until December 2019 as the corpse. That was what had happened. And then we had 2020. Once we started to think about it like this, we discovered that there were some really interesting events in Australia in late 2019 and early 20, which in fact none of us knew about. Australian education's been governed by national goals for many years, since the 90s, part of the accountability regimes. And the old 2008 Melbourne goals, the Melbourne Declaration, was replaced in December 2019 with this Alice Springs Mawatni Declaration. Trust me, I'm not sure that I'm saying that right. It's the word in Arrernte, which is the Indigenous language of Alice in the Alice Springs area, for that town. That declaration was launched in late 2019. It was then overtaken, in a sense, by the global Black Lives Matter campaign. And then in Australia, we had the joys of Rio Tinto, who blew up particular Indigenous caves in Western Australia. They had been inhabited by humans for 460 centuries. And indeed, parallels were drawn between Rio Tinto and the Taliban, because the Taliban, as you will remember, blew up the Buddhas of Bunyam, was it? Which were, I think, 15 centuries old. These caves had evidence of human habitation since before the Ice Age. What Rio Tinto got out of it was $138 million worth of iron ore. This event has been a real trigger, coming on top of the Black Lives Matter protests across the world, and has fueled Australian Black activism in a whole range of different ways. In September 2020, AITSL, which is the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership, the regulatory standard-setting body of Australian education, released a discussion paper, and its first paragraph is written at the bottom. Australian education systems were never designed for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. That is a very devastating comment to come from a government agency, in a sense, and in a way made us understand that the TMAG reforms were now a corpse. They'd been overtaken by a new agenda, which was actually recognising, at least in some form, the existence of First Nations people and indeed their claim to sovereignty, although whether indeed AITSL and the government will go that far is another question. We wrote our chapter in December 2020, and as you can see, there were a range of other moves by Australian agencies to take up and recognise First Nations peoples in the country. And I did think that Australia Post's decision to recognise Aboriginal countries within postal addresses was a really interesting move, because actually it makes it obvious then that we as settlers live on stolen land, and indeed we don't pay rent. The theoretical framework that I've been using in this draws on these ideas around situated seeing, knowing and acting. I use Melbourne, beautiful Melbourne, as an example here, because indeed it is the place where all of this has been happening. But it's also a now. It's a relational space-time with particular kinds of boundaries. Melbourne was established in about 1840, I think, as opposed to Indigenous people who've been on the continent for over 600 centuries. The fact that there's very little recognition, or has been until recently, is part of the effects of colonisation, which already impacts our knowledge building in this country. Melbourne of 2020 is a fluid now. It's constantly narrated, interpreted through subjective experience and translated into actions that fit life projects as well as workplace demands. I think what's important is that this picture, this Melbourne, reaches historically from a once to a here, and of course operates across many scales, from the individual right through to the global. Many of those towers are the towers of global enterprises with arms and networks and head offices in Europe and many other parts of the world. And as Latour says, bare facts and bare expectations are an impossibility because they're always embedded in these kinds of situated locales. Let me give you a little bit of a feeling of the part of the way we're approaching this historical rereading and writing by looking at TMAG as the corpse and the TMAG reforms and their playing out in integrated partnerships from the point of view of the end of 2020. And this is just a part of our narrative within the paper. And as you can see, what we've tried to do is acknowledge the First Nations sovereignty on this land, the permanent settlements, the civilizations that existed, and the substantial knowledge building that was generated over that time. That was disrupted, dislocated, and indeed destroyed by British settlement. However, people still live here. What we thought was interesting was that in our interviews with people in education, respectable, lovely professionals in universities and schools, almost nobody mentioned Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in their comments. And that in a sense confirms the point that the Eitzel discussion paper was making, that education in Australia has been designed for white people and not for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This has had a big impact not only on the people, but on the animals and the vegetation and the geology and so on of this country. Our agriculture is invasive and creates a whole range of problems as well. In terms of actually presenting the partnership, what we did what we do in the chapter is first of all to talk about then the corpse of TMAG, and using interview data and the case reports written by the teacher educator, we try to give a feeling for what it meant to do partnership learning, partnership work, and how they navigated the governance of these partnerships. We then went on and started to look at the end of 2020 at how the teacher educator and the partnership professionals were starting to think about their work for 2021, curriculum reviews for the next year. And then finally, what we did was compare, in a sense, or reread the corpse the discussion of 2021 in order to surface some of the silences, some of the gaps that were appearing in the discourse of education and teacher education, particularly focusing on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And where we ended up was to identify these gaps and silences, but also to think about the benefits of partnerships as institutional frameworks for further work. They provide resources for building on. And again, I'm going to very quickly give you a feeling of the nature of those rereadings. This is part of the teacher educators' reflections following the curriculum reviews for 2021 and some of the issues that were coming up for her, these fears about proximity after schools had been closed for so long, the problem of school closures, which meant that pre-service teachers were not able to graduate because they couldn't complete their teaching placements for practice teaching, which in the end did get fixed up by government. But she also talks, as you can see, about the way the public noticed teachers, like they noticed health workers and aged care workers, sometimes it seemed for the first time, and valued their contributions to the community. She noted too that teacher education partners weren't core business for schools, particularly because many of the schools closed the doors to teacher placements and didn't understand the connection with graduation, which caused a number of problems. But she does raise this question about the kinds of strengths that came into view, and that mostly those strengths, those teacher strengths that came into view, were not those that were defined by the standards for being a quality classroom-ready teacher. And so on the basis of this kind of comparative reading, we then started to, in the paper, in the chapter, try to think about what it might mean to rewrite the future. And so in this sense, the writing and reflection, the reading historically and the writing historically, offers a form of action, small, micro, but nevertheless a form of action. And indeed, what was interesting was that while Gloria, our acronym for the teacher educator, doesn't talk about the new goals, new national goals, or the kind of symbolism of this bilingual English Arenti naming, she has already read some of the Indigenous educators who are writing around the challenges of Indigenous education and two-way learning, two-way cultural learning. And there is concern about the model that's being proposed by AITSL, which is this cultural competency training, can backfire. And as you can see, Nakata does offer a comment on the complexity of the work that is being opened up by this new declaration, and indeed the sorts of issues that AITSL is addressing. But it also raised the question of what use are partnerships in this environment. While it seemed to us that the partnership that Gloria was involved with couldn't really address, and actually didn't even know about the new declaration, that was recontextualising the post-pandemic world of education, it was, the partnership was already a place where this kind of cross-cultural interprofessional work was respected. And that's a really important resource. But what it requires is inter-partner agreements that establish rules of the game. And in a sense, in this context, when we're talking about First Nations and a sovereign state that claims to be solely sovereign, we need a treaty about who can speak, who can negotiate, and how the diplomacy in all this can unfold. That's a little picture, a little window into that chapter. Let me go back to the workshop, which you can see here, our gathering, and finish by just referring to Latour. The two little pieces of free writing by Michelle and Claire at the beginning illustrated quite nicely what Latour talks about as the relation between matters of fact and matters of concern. His argument is that our critiques over the years have got lost in a sense because we read things we don't, this is in his terms more or less, things we don't like in terms of, we read them critically and kind of dismiss them as the idols of those who advocate for them, rather than actually being focused on the way things never exist outside their situatedness within a gathering. A thing is, in one sense, an object out there, and in another sense, an issue very much in here. The crisis of 2020 only has a reality because of the gatherings and the unusual gatherings that emerged through that year and brought things into view which we hadn't seen before, that we hadn't noticed. It means that there is interesting value, I think, in thinking further around this idea of what he talks about as a kind of stubborn realism that's focused on matters of concern, and understand that matters of fact are reconstructions, objectifications out of those gatherings. And in that context, the question of quality teaching is quite an interesting one, because it suggests to me that a classroom-ready teacher needs to be a critic. And Latour gives quite a nice definition of a critic, not the one who debunks, but the one who assembles. The critic is not the one who lifts the rug from under the feet of the naive believers, but the one who offers participants arenas in which to gather. The critic is not the one who alternates haphazardly between anti-fetishism, this kind of preoccupation with idols, and positivism, like the drunk iconoclast drawn by Goya, but the one for who, if something is constructed, then it means it is fragile and thus in great need of care and caution. And certainly in the Australian context, trying to work through the historical legacy of colonialism and its destruction of so much First Nations civilization. This care and caution is really, really important. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I've probably gone on too long. Thank you.
Many thanks, Terri. You haven't gone on too long at all. That was absolutely thought-provoking, evocative. I'm sure people have lots of comments to make and areas they'd like to explore with you. Do you want to, participants, do you want to have a think about things and start popping some things into the chat box that we can explore? While you're doing that, can I just be bold?
Yeah.
Perhaps just bring ask a couple of things which would get us going. I very much like the way that you wove into the different aspects of your understanding of different ways of knowing, different forms of experience, different ways of seeing into the text around a particular policy development and readings of that. And I was thinking in relation to this kind of liberal, pluralist drive of education. Like you, one of the things I think many of us were shocked about in the American elections, and perhaps saw some of our own contexts in, was this absolute divide amongst people between on different sides of political arguments, and this complete unwillingness to listen to each other. And many of us were shocked equally, I think, with different groups about the readiness to accept a particular case and dismiss the case and the views and the viewpoints of others. Now, that's a huge undertaking for education to try to address. Can education do it itself? Do we need to consider wider elements of social intercourse, the way we run governments, the way we run media, the way we allow free speech within the media? Is this something which education can tackle? It seems to me to be such a huge task that to ask an institution like universities, like schools, to deal with that alone is too much to ask. And then the second thing was an observation. When you had your slide at the beginning about crises, and you made the distinction between the male, slightly male, Anglophone. I was thinking, though, of course, that Arendt had travelled to the United States and about our movement as people. But I was also thinking, of course, of the humanist background of Arendt and her the way she was coming from this humanist. So, in part, is your appeal as well to a return to humanism of some form, some rejection of this totally rationalized outlook that the Anglo-American sphere has fallen for, even despite the way humanism itself has moved and changed and partially been modified in many European countries. So a couple of things really.
They're quite big questions. I mean, the question about the sort of the kind of false truth questions. As I say, I think both of these are enormous, and so I'll only kind of make some probably trivial comments. But I mean, I think Latour's quite interesting, the way he suggests that there's sort of what he calls three perspectives on if you like, understanding the world. The first of which is a fact-based understanding, and his argument there is that it is very much about the facts. It is very much about abstracting, all the stuff away. It is just looking at the bare facts, even though the bare fact cannot exist without the whole of the infrastructure of society and culture to hold it in place. But then he goes on to talk about the issue of critique, and the way critique has, in a sense, become complicated by preoccupations with representation, and reading critique representationally, rather than, in a sense, holding on to the kind of realist understandings of everyday life in a way that grapples with the relations and the culture and so on, but doesn't lose sight of the fact that there are arenas, that there are networks, that these networks are not just words, and he talks about that as the fairy problem, the fairy way of knowing, and look, I don't think I understand it properly, but I did think it was an interesting comment, because, I don't know about you, but when I hear people whinging on about, neoliberalism's doing this and neoliberalism's doing that, it's like, we had particular historical circumstances in the 90s, in the 80s, and then in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, and everything's changing all the time. There is no abstraction neoliberalism. There's particular politics that are playing through, which are embedded within those different contexts. And part of that politics is their recontextualization time after time after time, moment by moment. So I kind of think that that's a, you know, a fascinating debate. And trust me, I have not really engaged with that debate, so I'm not qualified to speak about it. But then he does talk about this idea of this third position, which he describes as the fair way, which is to kind of take this, you know, not to throw away the empiricism of positivism, but hold on to that as kind of observation and description and evidence and so on and so forth, but then understand it through these matters of concerns and the gatherings that generate them. Now, it seems to me when I look back to the work on Europeanization within ESA, and particularly when I think back to, you know, Martin Lorne and Antonio Novoa's book on fabricating Europe, you know, that's the work that they were doing, and it was fabulous. It's very, very generative. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but I do think that in some ways there is a bit more of a tendency, or there was earlier on, to kind of stick with the individualist model within the Anglophone world in comparison to the Eurozone. And I know there's interesting research that's been done by people like Lemke and so on, where they talk about the way Anglophone concepts of markets and Eurozone concepts of markets are very different. You know, the Anglophone is very individualist. It is the sovereign individual, whereas the Eurozone is much more premised on a kind of social market, which understands community and so on. So I kind of think these are interesting dimensions of this geopolitics that we're dealing with at the moment. So can education help there? Well, yes. You know, if we don't start to open up those things and actually understand those processes, then, you know, what's the social lever for changing things? You know, control, distrust, and accountability isn't really the way, you know, isn't really a sensible way to go, because it undercuts people and it means they don't contribute to the best they can. Equally, letting it go in a kind of laissez-faire Trumpism is not a good look either. So, you know, we're sort of between the devil and the deep blue sea here. And I think that education is one place, along with other cultural institutions that have a part to play. And teacher education is the crux of that, because that's where the professional education is happening. That's where the new teachers are being formed. And so that's why I think teacher education is important, even though it often tends to get pushed off the edge. Is this to do with humanism? Again, I'm not very good on isms, and I tend to get a bit lost in all of that. I wasn't really making a particular point, except that because I think that gender is a spectrum, and I think that there's a spectrum within Anglo and Eurozone worlds as well. So it's just that it was interesting that there were these quite different positions or perspectives on the understanding of crisis that people were working about. And I did find it slightly concerning that the teacher educator kind of almost saw crisis as a normal, you know. And I think there's value in saying, no, crisis isn't a normal. Crisis in little ways might be normal, but, you know, big crises are a real problem. And I think 2020 has shown us that that's the case, because it doesn't just affect people's lives. It affects democratic politics too, in ways that are scary. And you know, that's a place we don't want to go to down that line. And I think that we saw that with the US election.
Okay, thank you very much. I wonder if anyone else would like to come into that. Any? Can we try turning cameras on? I know that we said before, but we did want Terri to have some sort of sense of who's here. So could you those of you who are here? Oh, brilliant! That's wonderful.
Amazing.
So we can actually see. It's so much different to, talking to an audience that you can see than one where you simply get names.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Anyone like to join in with us? I think we people have avoided the chat room, so let's make this less formal. I'm going to turn the recording off so that people aren't conscious of that. Thanks. I'll say, before I turn it off, I'll say many thanks, Terri, for your wonderful presentation and for
Let me take a photo.
provoking us here.